Introduction. I'm Danielle Sanchez, and CPOC is very excited today to be putting on this informational workshop and appreciate Kevin O'Connell being here today to give an overview of the AB372 pilot, looking at obviously domestic violence programming and using evidence-based approaches to how those programs are set up and delivered. So Kevin, really appreciate your time today. And please let us know as we go if you have questions. The PowerPoint and slides will be provided. So just wanted to highlight that. We'll be looking at the chat or raised hands for questions as we go. But with that, I will turn it over to Kevin.
Great, thank you, Danielle, and welcome everybody to a Friday afternoon. Thank you for coming out to listen. I'm going to be covering a couple different topics today, but really the big focus is going to be some lessons we've learned from what's called the AB372 pilot, which was passed in 2019 to give 6 counties the opportunity to basically better align their domestic violence programming and BIPs with what I would call evidence. And that comes from a couple different places that I'll go into a little bit more information on. But the whole idea of this pilot really was to try to rethink how we look at domestic violence programming and how probation can really shape that, both in the programs it offers, as well as how it gets people to those programs, be it through risk assessment, needs assessment, as well as general case planning. And I think what makes this pilot really timely is that there's always a big discussion about how do we make sure the programming works for people. But I think a big question, at least for me, when we started this pilot was, programming is just one part of the puzzle. Not everyone responds to programming. A lot of the domestic violence requirements in statute may not resonate with everybody, but they also might have other needs as well. So how do we best meet the person's needs, but on top of that, always addressing the attitudes that got them there through domestic violence issues that come up. And so I'm going to go into a little more information in a second here, but because this is always my first question, yes, slides will be made available after the meeting, about 30 or so slides, and it's meant to be supporting a discussion here today. But the general idea here is really to look at what these pilots did, but also some of the ideas that might translate into your work in 52 other counties that are not part of the pilot. Because a lot of the themes, the issues, the challenges were things that will probably resonate with all of you if you work in the domestic violence area or have. And also I think just the general themes like where is the field going with these new ideas and a lot of just the changing norms. And to support that, I have a little survey I'd like if people who are able to, I'm gonna drop it in the chat right now. If people are able to take this really quick survey, just 5 questions, what I'll be doing is throughout the whole meeting, I'll actually be trying to bring these up during the presentation. So what I'll be doing is both as we answer all the questions or answer a few of these questions, I'll actually bring it up and see generally what's happening amongst the audience here. I know not everybody here is, maybe it carries a domestic violence case or is that part of that caseload, but the idea is to at least get a bit of real-time information about what your local policies and practices are, especially as it relates to risk assessment, things like offender pay and how do you subsidize or support offenders in terms of their ability to pay for the programming, and also the kinds of ways your curriculums are built. I think a lot of those issues, again, will span all the counties. We're hoping to at least then share some of the learnings we've had with the pilot itself. And to be clear here, so part of the benefit of this has been we've been grant funded. The initial AB372 actually had no funding attached to it. The counties did this all on their own, and I'll say in a second what those 6 counties are, but also it's being supported by CSAC, the California State Association of Counties, through a grant from the Blue Shield Foundation, with the goal here really to make sure we're supporting counties in their implementation, but also ways to report back to the legislature through regular reporting, but also areas like this to make sure we're talking about some of the issues and the questions that are out there. So next slide here. So what are we talking about today? So AB372 was passed in 2019 as different from the 1203.097 terms. And so what that means in practice is that these 6 counties, and I'll name them in a second, they perform a risk and needs assessment for future recidivism as well as infant partner violence using a validated tool. And what that means is you're not just talking about, I'm going to put this on mute because I'm getting a bunch of dings and dongs here. So thank you for taking the surveys. I would say. But the idea here is you have a number of different areas that are going to be, validated tools. That's a big part of it. The programs or the curriculum they're going to be offered for domestic violence have to be either evidence-based or promising in their design. And what evidence-based, means in various ways, but basically a rigorous study has shown it's effective at reducing recidivism, usually, hopefully, specifically domestic violence. But most of these studies don't really look at it that way. But the idea is to make sure the programs that are actually being offered for domestic violence curriculum have an evidence base to them. That's in part of the design. The programs have to have a written curriculum and operational guidelines. So it's not just that this person can be offering a curriculum, it has to be a written, documented curriculum. And I'm sure that'll be one of the questions in the survey. A lot of you have different experiences with providers and certifying people that offer a curriculum of some kind that maybe it's not written, maybe it's not organized in that way. These pilot counties had to offer one that actually was a written curriculum. And then last, and I think what to me is the most kind of interesting part of the pilot, the treatment dosage and the length does not have to be 52 weeks. It can be any length you want, or any length that actually is developed, as long as there's a rubric for determining that based on the risk information. But basically that means that counties can offer anything from a few weeks, 52 weeks. They can do different types of dosage models where you actually have, basically basically twice the dosage. So instead of a weekly meeting in 52 weeks, it's actually 2 classes a week for 26 weeks. But the idea is to kind of test some different ideas throughout this. And our partner counties of Napa, not Sacramento, Napa, Yolo, San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, Santa Cruz, and Santa Clara, we're all actually out there doing this work and trying to work on how do we actually put these into practice in 2019. And then if you probably remember 2020, like I do, a lot then suddenly changed. So what I'm going to kind of go through is kind of what we learned from the pilot, but also you think about what's changed in 3 years, it's been a lot. So some facts about the AB372 pilot and kind of the population, and I'm going to drop another item here into the chat. Oh geez, sorry, I did not do that. It's all coming apart at the seams. Back to it. Geez, now we're going. This second, sorry, Friday afternoon. The idea is that from this, we actually have quite a bit of information about these clients. And if you've worked in the field, there's not really a lot known about who folks are, what the general demographics are, or even kind of what some of their histories are. A lot of times, the people that come with domestic violence terms, really, they're not the people that you might expect. And oftentimes, there's not a lot of information about them. And so what we've done is actually go out and created the information about these folks from the pilot counties. And I'm going to drop a dashboard we put together in there. Got a little too fancy here with that. I'll do that in a second. But the idea is that we can actually take a look at who these folks are. So from the 6 counties, 1,200 people were actually put on domestic violence caseloads in the second year of the pilot. It's about 1,200 people a year across these 6 counties. 89% identified as male, 70% were non-white, 38% were not employed, 50% had previously served at least 30 days or more in county jail. About 55% had a prior domestic violence assault that was reported to police. So even on its top, you're already seeing this is a kind of different view of who these folks are, because some of these things you might expect, maybe previous criminal history, unemployment. But the flip side is, I think some of these also acknowledge some maybe differences. And one part to me that jumps out is, 11 or 12% are not male. So again, what does that say about how people are, what the treatment options are, how they're handled? Also, how do we kind of think about the gender of the people actually perpetrating and the people that are survivors of it. 30% are white, which means 70% are not white. What does it say about responsivity around language issues, around cultural issues, around cultural norms? How do we think differently about who these folks are and what they might need as different from everyone else? The unemployment issue will keep coming up because 40% unemployment. There's an offender pay model in place for 1203.097 clients, so they actually must pay for the most part for those, unless there's a sliding scale, but a pretty high unemployment rate for people that comes out in different ways. But the idea is to kind of get an idea of who these folks are and actually better able to define that in the population. And I'll drop in the dashboard in a second, or once I get to a different part. So how did counties actually change their practices? They had very programmatic approaches. And so part of the written curriculum and the evidence base means that counties really decided on a handful of different types. And so these, I just listed the 4 curriculum that are being used in our pilot counties. These are also being used in different ways. They're not all being used at the same amount, in the same way. And so they didn't just kind of take an approach off the shelf and do it. They adapted it to how they wanted to then use the risk level to actually look at that. And so those are the curriculum on the left there. I think probably some of those are probably familiar to you. The third one there, cognitive behavioral interventions, intimate partner violence, is a relatively new curriculum developed by the University of Cincinnati. And Streets to School is an online provider of different curriculum, different DB curriculum, among other things. Those two might be new to you. STOP, as well as another way, are probably, I think, are fairly common across the state. But again, they're all curriculum, they're all written. So again, they were able to be used locally. And then counties actually went out and developed the implementation model, decided how to work with partners on this, and then obviously providers and how to get them up and going. So the risk-based dosage, this gets to kind of what's really different probably from what you all experience if you're not part of the pilot. So each county, if you see them there, they all defined high risk, medium risk, and low risk in their own ways, but also it was all tied back to a risk assessment. And then behind this also is a little more structured decision-making that I'm not gonna really get into today, but I think some of the counties actually put together, I think, really useful ways to think about how do you take this kind of information about how long someone should spend in this program and based on what else they kind of need in place. We'll talk a little about risk needs responsivity a little later. But as you can see here, there's a variation here. For some folks, the high risk people still end up being a 52-week model. So that didn't really change very much. But we do see when you start getting people that are medium risk or low risk, now they're actually spending less time in the program. Because the idea is if you're low risk, spend less time with them, spend less resources on them. But also, this doesn't necessarily say you kind of stop any kind of intervention. What counties actually do is actually make more room for other types of interventions, be it employment, cognitive behavioral therapies, a lot of other kind of parts to it, substance use being a big one. So also what this also does, it made room for other types of treatment that actually might meet more of their criminogenic needs. And I think that to me is going to be one of the big takeaways from this, is it's not just that they were able to kind of change the dosage for the domestic violence intervention, they're actually able to substitute in their case plan in a more fluid way, because some of the restrictions around the curriculum are very specific. Like once your court order is passed, there's kind of a clock sort of starts with people. And so how do you kind of rethink that if now you don't have to be required everybody takes a 52-week program? And so one of the benefits too may not just be efficacy of these new approaches, but also if somebody's going to spend 10 to 15 weeks in this curriculum instead of 52, that's also a lot of time and money they're getting back to then, again, do things and hopefully better their life and make improvements. But this really kind of is almost like a way to say a lot of the probation practices that are out there already now is a way to kind of use those in a domestic violence kind of concept. Because before, that 52-week mandate really was very different than how we would probably think about the work of probation be, making sure we're taking into account the person's risks, but also make sure we're treating them in a way that's actually going to make them, lead to behavior change, but also not substitute victim safety. Let's see. So what are the kind of questions that came out of this? So what are the interventions that change offender attitudes and behaviors? Like, do these different curriculums, are these really what matters to reduce recidivism, or are there other things going on? And as I mentioned, some of these counties are able to substitute in and out different interventions that aren't just about the attitudes and behaviors of domestic violence, but also other things that actually might, again, make an impact as well. And so I think, what are the actual interventions that work, and what does work actually mean? Being a really important question. How much treatment dosage is actually needed to be effective? As I mentioned, if you can change it from being always 52 weeks to something else, what if you find out that actually after week 32, week 37, week 26, whatever it is, that's actually whoever's going to recidivate is already on that track, but who may not, you actually couldn't actually divert them to something else and start them down a different track. But the idea is to kind of figure out what that right amount of dosage is and not assume it's always 52 weeks. In terms of assessment, how do we kind of match up what a criminogenic risk and needs assessment might say with like things that are actually specific to domestic violence? And so there's some, all 6 pilots chose the same tool, the ODARA, which is the Ontario something risk assessment tool, with the idea being that they actually use that in conjunction with their standard risk assessments, and putting those together actually gives them a fuller picture of people's risk. Because you can have somebody that's relatively low risk for general recidivism, just because of the way, if you think about low risk, that means you could be, you might not have much of a criminal history, be relatively older, and not have a lot of previous justice experience. That would kind of make you low risk in some ways, but looking at IPV or looking at using a DV specific tool might show the person actually is higher risk overall. So it's really differentiating general recidivism patterns from DV specific recidivism patterns. And then also, like, how do you use decision-making frameworks to make sure that you're actually, in an organized way, getting people to the right risk-based supervision, which, again, not unlike a lot of the other probation practices. And lastly, at the bottom there is then the socioeconomic side. Does the ability to pay impact program success? If people are, being dropped out of groups or being closed out of groups or can't pay and decide to stop going, how do we kind of take that into account as a barrier and try and remove it, or at least better understand it? And then another one, like, how do victim offender dynamics impact success or case management for people that are actually staying together and families that are still together after the domestic violence incident? What does that look like? How does that look different than somebody who actually is going to be separate and not have any engagement going forward? But again, these are all complex things, and I think domestic violence, the challenge of it is these are usually ongoing relationships. Oftentimes there's obviously families involved with this. So how do we kind of think about it a little bit differently, but not, again, substitute victim safety or victim voice for this, for a different kind of programming model. And so where did this come from? A little bit of history. This is actually from a 2008 multi-county study of over 100 VIPs in California. What they found out about 55% completion rate. So we kind of use that in our head of saying, historically, about a 55% completion rate for most VIPs. And that's across many different providers, not just one county, but 6 counties, lots of providers. The reoffense rate for new offenses is about 40%, actually had a new offense within about 12 months. But only about 19% of those actually were DV offenses. So you're already kind of seeing a difference there from, yes, folks may have general recidivism patterns, but they're not all going to be domestic violence related crimes, and maybe not even the same victim. So how do we get more specific about that and not just make it about one type of offense, but kind of differentiate it a little bit? And the demography wasn't so different what I described, but they had a little more information about 40% live with the victim still and with children. 80% are making less than $25,000 a year. So again, that's not a lot of money. 2008, it's a little more money than now. But the idea is that already have an economic issue there. High unemployment, 40% unemployment, and also 50% had prior drug arrests. So you're already talking about, this is a complex situation. How do we have more options for treating it? And this slide was kind of the other kind of basis for this was, there's a 2014 review about 11 rigorous evaluations of DD programs. And what they found is that Duluth or Duluth-like programs, which are really based on the kind of the power and control model, really no effect on recidivism overall. But part of the problem was that very few sites actually do the Duluth model to its, to actually its fidelity. So oftentimes you're kind of saying you're doing the Duluth model in philosophy, but really not doing it maybe as the model says. So again, lots of variation there across counties and across the country. And then 5 evaluations of kind of what we're calling non-Duluth models, like cognitive behavioral models, were found to actually have some pretty significant reductions in recidivism. But there's so many different types out there, be it individual therapy, cognitive behavioral therapies, we couldn't choose just one. So, and again, this also highlights kind of the differences across kind of the philosophies out there. Is really domestic violence an issue of power and control and attitudes and different kind of gender issues, or is there really a way to kind of change thinking and thought patterns along with some education and accountability? So again, some of this kind of is kind of where we started. Really, the field isn't set on what exact program works, but we also know that more than just programming makes and changes somebody's behavior. I'm going to stop in about 2 minutes to kind of basically take a break on and kind of just ask some questions, but I want to get through one more and kind of risk assessment. And so what we found out when we actually looked at people's risk assessment scores was that only about 22% had a high general recidivism number. So in terms of like using the general recidivism tool, as you might, because all these counties, you also use a general recidivism tool. So like the LSCMI, the Compass, the CASE, only 22% were actually high risk to recidivate, which makes you think that some of these folks might have a different approach or a different outlook for some of these folks, knowing that they have different recidivism levels. But now back to the kind of the comment about the kind of relatively high risk of DV, 42% actually scored high on the domestic violence risk assessment tool. So it kind of gives you, it's more like a matrix. It's how do you kind of find the folks that are low risk to recidivate and low risk for DV. Those maybe you put in a very different place than somebody who's high risk for DV and high risk to recidivate. So again, it's how do you kind of use these tools together, not just say it's one or the other, but really it's both. And how do we kind of look at that and actually make sure we're kind of looking at both the public safety needs as well as kind of changes in kind of needs and dosage. All And so let's see, let me refresh this. Let me take it off screen share for just a sec. And there, any questions in the chat, Danielle, before I kind of?
No, not at this time, but certainly if there are, I'd encourage people to put those in the chat or raise hands.
Okay. So this is the first kind of question on there. We had asked if any of the counties have any counties there. Let's see, sorry, get bigger. What kind of tools they use and if they actually use other types. Let me share. Sorry, I should have done this the fancy way. All right, I'm gonna do this a different way because this isn't really working for me.
And then in the meantime, I do see a raised hand if you're ready for a question.
That'd be great.
Sounds good. Megan?
Hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I'm just curious about how you capture recidivism for these stats, because a lot of times, at least in our county, we'll arrest somebody for a CPO violation. New charges are never filed, or if they are, sometimes they're dismissed in light of the VOP admission. So when it's just a VOP, is that getting captured as recidivism? Or is it just new charges?
So it's new charges, and then or restraining order is also one. But in this one, the VOP tends not to be, because I think that's the way that at least the legislation defined it. But I think that's also where we're trying to think about what the actual impact of the victim is and what you do see those. And so we do see some rate of violations of probation or of restraining orders, but the VOPs themselves, unless they're related to a new crime, they wouldn't be captured here. Unless they were, a restraining order violation. So for the DV risk assessment question, I hope that I'll get back to recidivism in a second, because that is one of the more challenging, it's always the most challenging part of this. And so one of them was, do any of the counties actually offer an online version of any curriculum? Sorry, this isn't that. Had this all in my head, it's gonna be great. Where'd my question go? There it is. So I was looking at, so about 55% or 66% actually offer the ODARA as a DV tool. It looks like a number of other assessments are done as well, the SARA. But I think what, so it sounds like what I'm kind of seeing here is that, about 66% do offer the ODARA, which is, again, is an IPV particular tool. And then a lot of other probably different types of tools, but I'm kind of seeing most of these are almost like standard risk assessment tools, or also some lethality tools, so the SARA. But I think what these two also kind of showed us was a lot of these tools are normed to a certain population. The ODARA is actually based on spousal abuse, male spousal abuse. But then how do you use that with a female population or other types of people, other types of relationships? And so we're kind of seeing as the world keeps changing and these tools have to keep up. But it looks like there is kind of a push now to kind of have some different approaches there.
And Kevin, there are a few questions in the chat now. I think the first of which regarding what tools are being utilized by counties, I think covers what you just went over. But if there are additional follow-up in the chat, please let us know. Another question regarding for the pilot counties, did that include all felony and misdemeanor DV cases? And also did they include informal probation cases?
So it should include all cases, all felony misdemeanor DV cases. In terms of informal, it kind of depended on the local jurisdiction. I have to go back to that one and see if those would include the informal cases. I believe they do, because anybody with DV terms would be a part of that. But I have to double check on that. But it should be basically anybody who was eligible would be. I will say that Santa Clara had a little different approach, because they actually try to create a comparison group or two separate, almost like a true pilot within their county, because they think they have the size and the volume. So they might have it. I'm not have to go back and check with them about how they might have done it differently, but I believe it was kind of a randomized approach to you get either the new pilot or the old version. Any other questions there?
I think you covered so far.
Great. All right. So sorry for the technical issue there. I'm just going to go not do. Can everyone see the screen okay? I'm kind of going away from the big old Jumbotron here. Okay. And so what do people actually get in terms of treatment types? Basically the difference here is about almost half actually still got 52 weeks. That means the other half didn't. And so we have made a number of different kind of dosage levels, but even that kind of says we're kind of changing how we're approaching the amount of time people are spending. And that's really based on that risk assessment score. So really, I mean, just under half didn't get a 52-week program. So in some ways you can think about that being kind of part of this intervention as being, we're kind of reducing the amount of time and exposure they get to just the DV specific programming. Doesn't mean they weren't getting other types of programming too, but the idea is that this is just one part of it. So that was kind of one operational piece to drop that part out and make sure people could have different levels based on their risk. And so 26 weeks was the most common alternative, but also other counties had 10 and 16 weeks based on low risk supervision or low risk clients. In terms of completion, this has been one of the more challenging things. And part of this is because of the way that, time marches on with some of these programs. If you're looking at 2019 and 2020, about 6 months into the pilot, COVID hit and basically it changed everything. But at least we can kind of get an idea of who was completing and when, at least in that first year of the cohort or first kind of completion cohort, and 50% had a positive result. But these a big chunk there actually who are still pending or actually don't have any kind of a completion yet. And that's been kind of our work in the last couple of years, is to kind of disentangle that, because there's a lot of kind of nuance to who completes the program and when and how long that actually takes. But so I think for that first group, we had about 55%. We're actually, I'm going to do a second round as well. But this is also kind of a rolling target because of the way that these work in terms of who actually started the program might be different than their actual probation start date, because some of these folks don't actually start the program as soon as they're actually eligible to start the program because of just group starting, but also with COVID, that slowed a lot of things down. So in terms of kind of like the COVID impact, this is definitely going to be one of them where people actually aren't starting these programs as soon as they're maybe eligible or start probation. And then kind of the question about recidivism, again, always kind of a big one in this is like really the definition, what counts as recidivism. And in this one, the legislation actually defined it as a new conviction, a new arrest, or a restraining order violation. And so what we saw here was in the blue is actually the people actually getting recidivism events during the program. So 13% had a new conviction in that first, that first cohort. 13% had a new conviction during their program, but only 6% had a conviction after that. Those are meant to be cumulative. So you might have something where like about 20% had a new conviction within a year, or sorry, 6 months plus the time after their program. A little bit higher rearrest rate. Again, about 28% in the program, 13% after, and a relatively small, about 10% had a restraining order violation, and 5% after the program. COVID obviously impacts these rates because people aren't circulating as much out in the community. They're at home. We also don't know if this is actually kind of worsening some of the effects for survivors because they're maybe stuck back at home with their batterer. And then also because people were unable to really circulate, we also might not be seeing people who would have recidivated otherwise. It also assumes the time in the program had some kind of an impact. And that's something that we don't necessarily think is always true. I mean, just because they entered the program doesn't mean that was the time that they were the most engaged, because if they have other concurrent needs like substance use, education, employment needs, that program itself may not be really what's going to change their behavior. It might be something else. So a model like this almost assumes the program is really what's keeping them engaged. And I think with DV programming, it may be not true, but we're trying to figure out what that program impact is in program. But also a key part of this is a smaller number of people actually had a DV related crime. I think we found about 20% of these. So even though these are expressed as percentages, only about 20% of all the recidivism actually was a new DV related crime. So again, these are kind of related to general recidivism still and not DV specific recidivism. One of the kind of outcomes we're looking for, and this has been challenging as well, is getting victim feedback about kind of the programming itself. And so we've worked with all the pilot counties and how to kind of like basically best do this in a way that actually respects victims' kind of privacy as well as their right to move on, but also then gets meaningful feedback about the process from them, especially around kind of, is this program really changing people's, like the person that battered them, their perceptions, their attitudes, and really kind of changing their behavior towards the victim. And so what we did see some positive impressions from people that were able to be reached about their attitudes, improvements in calmness, sobriety, empathy from the programming, or at least concurrent with the programming. But to say the response rates were relatively low, for reasons you probably could imagine, is that, you know, you really kind of have to have current information to contact them, as well as their consent to be interviewed, which was really a big part of why we didn't have probably more responses. Was a lot of folks, we couldn't reach them, or they had already moved on, or they didn't want to talk about it. So that's a big part of it, is actually being able to connect with them. Because if you think about it, these interviews are being done sometimes a year or year and a half more, or after the actual incident itself. So in some ways, time marches on. It's harder and harder to get responses from people to see retrospectively what they thought of a program. A lot of victims actually weren't in contact with the actual offender anymore. So even if they, you know, they haven't maybe seen the person in a year and a half, they wouldn't have any opinion about whether the person's changed or not. And also, lastly, they may not actually be safe for the cyber to actually talk about that, or maybe they're still fearful or in danger in that moment they're living with the person. So this is one where we're still working with counties on how to best do this and actually feed that back to policymakers and also to the counties themselves. Because it's also a workload issue to make sure that people actually can do this with authenticity, with empathy, and really engage victims in a useful, important way, and not just have it be a survey you might send to them, but actually be a conversation. Because the risk of re-traumatization is quite high. But how do you do that in a way that really is going to do it justice and not just be a check the box type thing? This is very different than other types of probably work that gets done. So it's very much a hands-on, one-on-one interview style that we found to be the most, you know, probably the most effective. But again, that takes a lot of partnership and effort. And on top of that, you know, just the logistics of tracking folks down. A couple of COVID impacts we saw in the first year. First in year 1 and year 2, those reported to us from the pilot counties. There's a lack of face-to-face programming and supervision engagement, probably not surprising to you all, but in 2020 and 2021, probation changed, programming changed, behaviors changed. And so a lot of the things kind of went hybrid in terms of the programming, where a lot of the vendors and a lot of the programs and the curriculums went to a hybrid model, or more likely an online version, but also supervision engagement stuff changed as well. A lot of providers didn't really have the capacity to really transition to an online model, or didn't really have the logistics set up. So again, there was some implementation gaps there about how to kind of do that. So again, we learned a lot about kind of what works and what doesn't in terms of implementation there. In terms of the court process, you have delays in court processing, trials are delayed, and also people actually showing up for hearings delayed as well. So matters really weren't moving through the court as you might expect as normal, and we're just now kind of getting out of that part of it. But the whole system was kind of stopped for a while. And lastly, the shelter-in-place mandates might have pushed new acts of domestic violence like into the shadows, and actually made it harder and harder for victims to actually speak out and to, you know, and actually to call the police or get help for what they needed. So it might have suppressed what was actually happening. There's probably a lot more stories in this, and there's probably a good maybe chance to stop and kind of hear from folks about how, you know, how did COVID actually impact their programming during the kind of last year or two.
And I'll see there, Kevin, do you want to see if there's any questions at this point?
Yeah, let's
open it up if there's any raised hands. Feel free to put questions into the chat.
I'm looking at, I'm actually reading Arturo's right now. I think these got mentioned. So is this study implying that the population of offenders clients also be supervised under pretrial deferred entry of judgment supervision model, which includes BFT programming? This doesn't actually speak to kind of the pretrial part. I think probably with some of these, this is like the pretrial SB1 or SB 129 and kind of the growth of pretrial recently was kind of after this pilot. I think this pilot generally is about formal supervision. So really didn't envision how an expansion of pretrial would impact this group. There are some counties that actually do start relatively early in terms of their engagement with the client, in terms of the VIPs. as well as doing the assessments for the ODARA very early in the process as well, to understand both their pretrial risk as well as their risk of IPV. And I see Trevor here has that's actually a big one, is actually the, everyone went online, and actually a lot of providers now don't want to go back. And I think that's really been one of the things we're kind of seeing, is that the hybrid model works for a lot of people, but how do we kind of make sure you can do both? And the online version, I think, is, had a lot of benefits to it. We heard from counties that have made it easier for them to actually kind of be able to audit and understand what was actually going on in the classes. So they could actually pop into an online class and actually monitor it. It actually brought up kind of new models of actually engaging people. But the problem has been, how do you actually go back to that? And I think, like, we're all kind of struggling with what value does in-person actually create, and how do you implement it effectively? There are some providers that actually are kind of online first, but we're kind of seeing as there is kind of a new kind of way of doing this that came out of COVID that I think we're all still trying to better understand and see, like, are we actually getting better results? Because the other thing we kind of found out was that some providers went online, but really had no way to see if they were actually improving engagement or not, and actually really weren't ready for that online jump, where other ones really have the ability to kind of track online, track engagement, as well as be able to track metric wise what people are actually doing and how they're doing it. So it's more of like an online learning class from the start, rather than kind of making something online that previously was in person. So we're seeing a lot of kind of differences in how providers are doing that as well. And on top of that, some of these curriculums aren't quite ready for an online version. But again, that's all part of the learning process. And so maybe I'll jump to the next thing. I was kind of, I guess maybe this has probably all been kind of said a little bit, but effective intervention, I think, for domestic violence doesn't have to be different than what it is probably for your general supervision approaches. Obviously, there's more specific knowledge, statutes, as well as, I think, the family dynamics that always come into this, but you really have a who factor. How do we deliver the most intense intervention to higher risk participants? Make sure we're targeting criminogenic needs to people that need it. So what are we actually trying to do? Make sure we're looking at styles of kind of learning and understanding, but also breaking down barriers like housing, homelessness, mental health, and other ones. And also make sure it's being done with fidelity. So I think nothing is inconsistent with how you might develop a domestic violence program or curriculum or a BIP. But a lot of times, I think some of the things that the 52-week program mandate creates is a structure that really doesn't let you adapt to either local conditions, local provider capacity, or individual client needs and kind of clients, and what actually might make them more effective or be more successful. And so with that, I think what we kind of learned was each county, as a local state, used local stakeholders to choose a curriculum. So it wasn't like that through the pilot, there was like a list and people had to choose off it. It was a very organic process. So in early 2019, each county worked with stakeholders to actually figure out, what does that curriculum look like? What kind of a provider are we going to use? Are our providers actually ready to actually take some of these things on? And so it really was kind of a local discussion. And I think most counties have continued that that DD roundtable locally. And that usually include, a couple of providers, the district attorney's office, public defender, probation, obviously, possibly behavioral health or other service providers. But really is a way to kind of make sure we're all kind of understanding what the capacities of the providers are, but also make sure we're pushing things ahead in terms of what that quality can look like. The only requirements were it's a written curriculum, and at least the premise or the approach was promising or evidence-based. Some counties brought in new providers, and actually, I think there's quite a bit of implementation learning to happen about how long it took to get providers ready to go. Some of the challenges to the business model that actually creates of actually having and expecting more from providers in an offender pay system. What does that actually create in terms of how well they can actually staff it and the consistency they need to deliver a high quality written curriculum versus what maybe otherwise would be delivered in a more conversational group style. So we kind of found is that actually the rigor of a written curriculum created actually new challenges, but not bad challenges to think about how to improve the general approach and kind of ability of BIPs to deliver services. And then COVID, and then you have a hybrid option. So all this kind of stuff is going on, halfway through 2020, and then everything changes. So it's kind of a pilot within a pandemic. And I think one of the things we're kind of reflecting on now is that it was like 15 or 20 different little studies you might do in one pilot. And that created a lot of challenges, but also a lot of things we're learning about how to express that and see if there's value to the rest of the field. So I want to go back to the poll real quick, not blow it up this time. and kind of just get a sense of what different options y'all offer. Let's see. So one of the questions I asked was who offers what programs? Because I had a couple examples there from the pilot, but I was kind of curious of how big their reach is. And it looks like Streets to Schools is pretty prevalent. Quite a bit of exposure to that. So again, it's an online curriculum, kind of an online first approach. Individual therapy or individual therapeutics as a certified provider. CBI IPV, which is the University of Cincinnati's Intimate Partner Violence curriculum. Stopped by David Wexler, about 9%, and then kind of a lower and lower from there. But part of the value of this is actually to see all the different things that are out there, because some of the requirements around a written curriculum, anybody probably could use, but again, you have the providers in place to actually do that. But again, this is just, to me, it's interesting because all these different providers have a slightly different approach, but a lot of times you do see similarities in what they offer and how they do it. And at least, in terms of some of these, more of a cognitive behavioral model is more common we've seen. But again, some of the ones that offer a Duluth style or Duluth approach can be done in a couple different ways, but it's good to kind of know there's a variety of things out there. And then the ability of online curriculums. Let me refresh this one. All right. About 21%, so about half, 50% actually offer an online curriculum, which I think is really interesting that there's actually a hybrid or online version of what we're doing, even though, so some of that has stayed with us, but even now, that's a new reality, I think, of a lot of counties, is that the online version of this is new, it's happening, it's probably not going to go away. So how do we make sure we're implementing it in a way that's actually effective? And actually the providers are actually supported in terms of what they're going to need to actually technically support this, logistically support this, and also, from a what does this actually say about people's ability to actually attend these classes? Because if they don't have good bandwidth, what does that mean about their ability to attend? So again, this was kind of out of the COVID response, but again, it's a new opportunity for probation to offer a new way of delivering this in a lot of different ways. Even if you do have a 52-week mandate, you still can offer it different ways, and hopefully that increases engagement and increases success. But it's new, so we really don't know. And then the last question one, let's see, written curriculum. So it looks like most counties do require a written curriculum. And this is maybe one I'd like to stop on and see kind of what that looks like, or how you've kind of done that through your certifications. So folks had some comments on this one, like how they develop these written curriculums for folks, and how they kind of gotten their providers to do that, and if they ever had any challenges with getting providers to buy into that.
Kevin, did you want to open it up for a question on that? I just want to make sure.
Yeah, sorry, I'm flowing. Yeah, I mean, if people's kind of experience with kind of basically developing curriculum or working with providers to choose a curriculum, just kind of what have people's experience has been recently, and where do you all see kind of opportunities for that?
So if there's any comments, feel free to raise hand, put it in the chat. I see we have a question from Candace Draper. Go ahead.
Sorry, I had to figure out how to get off mute. So one of our providers, we actually have a standards and have outlined in accordance with the penal code, the structure of what needs to be included in the programs. So what we notice is some of the programs, some of the curriculum that's out there for providers to use is very male centric, meaning that it is not gender neutral. One program actually did go with a program that, clearly on the cover it says 4 minutes, written by a licensed clinician, and the other one they found was for those that identify as a woman. And it's interesting because you read both and understanding the gender responsive. I actually preferred reading through it, knowing how important it is that there's different things a woman or those that identify as a woman would need in place in order to engage in treatment. And the book spoke to that. So it's a lot of reading through it to make sure it hits all the elements, but it hits all the elements either gender neutrally or for the gender it's intended to be presented to. That's been my experience. I looked at another one where it's kind of a Duluth take and advised the program that it wouldn't work because it's not hitting all the elements required.
Mhm.
And forgive me, I do not have our standards in front of me, so I can't tell you all those elements. I do want to say it includes the effects of domestic violence on children, and the stereotypes of domestic violence.
Yeah, so I think that is, as we're kind of thinking about of this, I think that's one where we're kind of like, because we also do know there's a number of new approaches out there, but a lot of those really haven't trickled down to what's widely available. And I think what we do see is a lot of the male like the language kind of really being focused on men, as well as back to the assessment part of it. Really, it's all been, because it's a 20 or 30-year-old approach. A lot of these are they are based on again, an older view of what domestic violence is and who it's between. And I think the complexity there, I think, has become very apparent of who are the two people that are interacting and what does that look like? And do we actually have the right types of language available and training available, especially when providers are coming to you with new ideas or new information? How do you vet that, and how do you, again, certify it, knowing that there might be some, something innovative about it, but also has to meet some criteria?
And I do see before you move on, Kevin, a question or hand raised from Andrew.
Yeah, I was going to answer your question about providers having a paper curriculum that they hand in during the recertification process. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I've been experiencing is that a program will have a curriculum that they have developed or use, but it's not necessarily used by the facilitator that is conducting the class at the time. And it's one of two reasons. One, because the facilitator just isn't using it, but more often than not, it comes down to a good program, and good evidence-based will say that you also need to stray from the curriculum in order to tackle the events that are happening right then and there with the group dynamics. And it's really tough for a good curriculum to happen when the group dynamics change every couple of weeks, with people floating in and out depending on what personal week they're in of the 52-week battles intervention program, if that makes any sense.
It does. And one of the I think some of the curriculums actually has what's called like a modified closed group, I think is how they've termed it, is that the first 2.5 months is closed. And then the rest of it, you can kind of have that inner dynamic, because you do start to repeat content a little bit. But I think that ends up being one of the bigger challenges. How do you keep group cohesion and group interest in these, given it is a long time, especially with you have, again, interrelated issues that come up in these meetings around just classroom maintenance, but also, sobriety issues, other kind of, I would just say display, like people actually supporting each other versus kind of making sure each one holding each other accountable. And I think there's also a lot of that is just those changing week to week, month to month issues. But one of the things we've kind of seen is like having different group structures helps that, but that also makes it harder. That you have to find more providers to then you start closing off groups. So again, I think a lot of this is how do we support these different types of provider models, but then also know that there's costs there involved with that, and also capacity.
Yeah, because we have to remember a lot of these providers, some are non-profit, but some are for-profit for whatever reason. It doesn't matter, regardless to what probation wants. But the closed groups for 3 months, I can see that being a huge problem for smaller counties that may have one or two providers only, that may only get 10 cases every 6 months anyway.
Mhm. And I think that's been, as we've kind of looked at alternative, like, and I have a slide in a second about this, but like if we look at like alternative, more nuanced interventions and maybe just look at certain needs, and you actually start, kind of taking more and more folks and focusing the intervention more, the groups get smaller and smaller. And so in all reality, there's probably only 10 to 15 counties in the state that could actually support that in terms of how many people are moving through it. So I think that's a big part of like, who's actually going to do the work, and actually are the groups big enough to support based on kind of local providers in a back to an offender pay model. There's not a lot of incentive to build a big network there for something that usually doesn't pay. It's hard to get the revenue for it. And if you're for profit, you might have other interests there about how to, make sure you can make a profit out of it. And I think I think to me it's related to this, but some county, even though there is, it's largely an unfunded mandate. I'm not sure if that's the right word for it, but it feels that way. There is no funding stream attached to domestic violence treatment, and so really, and it's also made to be actually by the basically an offender pay model. And I think when this actually works out in practice, is each provider has their own sliding scale that they might use, but those aren't always transparent to the person actually getting the service. But counties have actually started to do different things with this. And one thing we're going to kind of look at is what are the attributes of this offender pay model. And part of it is counties have actually started subsidizing this with their own money or other pots of money. And I think this is really interesting that 60% or about don't have it, but 40% do have some kind of way of subsidizing actually the providers as well as the people there beyond the sliding scale. So actually, we're already seeing counties start to put their own money into this to make sure you don't have a barrier of completion being the reason why somebody doesn't go to the program. Because that the study I mentioned from 2008 was actually seeing a number of people actually were being violated back into custody again because they weren't paying. Maybe that's kind of one version of this, but maybe they shouldn't get their diploma or get their certification, if they haven't paid. But again, if they're going to be remanded to custody because they can't pay, that seems a little bit different. But I think what some of the counties are trying to do is really remove the pay barrier, knowing that other barriers definitely exist and some people aren't, they'll find a new barrier to find. But the idea is if money is a barrier here, how do we make sure we're not creating that? And the other reason is a lot of times if the family is still together, really the person paying for that is going to be, the person maybe possibly who was victimized. So again, there's kind of this unclear reason of why it's an offender pay model when you might have all these kind of downstream effects on the family as well as the people that are going to be actually paying it.
And Kevin, there's a question in the chat about generally how long each class is. And I know you talked about dosage and is it, 1 day a week, 2 days a week, but can you talk a little bit about generally how long maybe those classes are held? Or does it vary?
It varies. Most of them are once a week. Santa Clara is the only one that I think I know of right now that actually is really, it's still the same. You still get 52 1-hour sessions, but it's in a very dense 26 weeks. And I think they have a 60 to 90 minute session, as well as some other interventions as well. I think the classes themselves are once a week, 1 hour for the DV portion of it. But I think that's what we're also looking at, and I'll have a slide here in a second. What are the other interventions people are actually getting referred to concurrently with their DV treatment or in kind of different orders because they have a little more time flexibility if it's not 52 weeks. Okay, the next one. And this is the one about the kind of the pilot of kind of we're calling an enhanced IPV curriculum. But the idea is to actually look at this from a way to meet specific criminogenic needs. And so part of the Blue Shield Foundation funding was actually to develop, I would say, a partner curriculum to the University of Cincinnati's curriculum. So it's going to be a cognitive behavioral model that actually addresses substance use in particular. This slide is incorrect with the employment part, but actually it would be basically a substance use intervention in terms of IPV. Because a lot of times what we're seeing is that a lot of the people that have maybe needs around needs or terms of domestic violence also have concurrent needs around substance use. So we want to make sure that we can actually address that a little bit differently. And the idea was to actually, for the University of Cincinnati to actually develop this in the next probably 9 or 12 months. And then 2 pilot counties will actually be implementing this kind of new, we're calling it kind of a little bit different curriculum, but a standardized one that actually has a 52-week model part of it, or kind of different dosages that can be expanded and changed. But the idea is it really would focus substance use and what drives that part for people with a substance use need, because that was the overwhelming theme amongst a lot of people, at least a lot of the folks we were seeing that were medium and high risk was substance use on top of the IPV. So the idea was we don't want to just refer them to a substance use provider without the context of really what, when they do use or they are not sober, this is possibly what happens. They do have these tendencies. So how do we make sure we hold them accountable in the language of IPV and IPV intervention, but also address the substance use at the same time? Because most other curriculums have very little to say about substance use. Maybe it's, I think the ones that I've reviewed, it's only maybe a week or two or less that actually looks at substance use in general. That's one part of it. And then if we really want to raise the bar on what's being offered, we need to kind of find other ways to access funding streams like Drug Medi-Cal. So one of the ideas was to see if we can bring more providers into the mix that actually could maybe possibly draw other funds like Drug Medi-Cal to actually provide a higher quality of service, a higher quality intervention, and bring more people to this population instead of it being just a referral that has no connection to the message we're trying to get to these people, which is you need to be accountable for what you've done, change your behavior, but we also know the needs might be complex. And this is the idea is to have those probably the curriculum in the next probably 9 months or so. But again, these are the kind of things we're kind of finding out from the pilot. We can't just have the curriculums are what they are, but are there other ways to offer this that actually would meet more needs? Let's see, jump. And so one of the things we're actually looking at in particular from a kind of what we're calling issue briefs is the offender pay model and DV treatment. Because part of it is when you have this model out there, really it kind of limits what you can actually do in terms of the treatment. And also, again, it has these negative impacts of actually people's ability to pay, especially with 40% of people being unemployed. How can we make sure we're kind of thinking a little bit differently about this? And so the brief is probably available in the next month or two. Will be kind of a review of the current practice, current approaches, which counties are subsidizing. I think we, of the pilot counties at least, which ones are subsidizing and how, and then what do they actually look like in terms of their provider network? Because one of the theories I have is that when you have an offender pay model, you're really kind of limiting who's going to be in your network of services, and that really limits what probation can do and certify. Because again, for-profit, not-for-profit, I mean that isn't the biggest issue, but again, how do you pay and keep the lights on when there's not a lot of money to be had with these programs themselves? So how can we kind of both raise the quality if we want to kind of have more options, but also do it in a way that actually maybe solves some of the barriers to treatment? And so why should we kind of do this? And I think this is, to me, the ability to pay is a big one. Varied certifications and sliding scales make it really hard to navigate. And also how do you actually create a business model for people when there's so many different variations on this? So again, when you're out there certifying people or certifying programs and providers, the various sliding scales end up being a challenging thing, both for the offender to navigate, probably as well as in the certification part of it. And then at the end of the day, for the provider as well to actually create a sustainable business model. Again, victims who are oftentimes still financially connected are also the ones who are subsidizing the program fees. And I think just in general, how do we rethink the business model of this and not just, again, go with what's been in place for 20 plus years, knowing that now counties are actually putting other funds into this, be it from realignment or SB 678 or other funds to try and make a dent in this and really take down a barrier. A couple ideas that are going to be kind of presented in this brief, move BAPs to more of a human service model. So other ways to kind of blend funding together or act in more of an integrated way. The substance use one is part of it. Changing the certification process to standardize some of the sliding scale methods statewide so you're not left with so many different variations provider to provider. Prioritize completion of programming and success over payment. How do we kind of make sure we can do that effectively and know what we're paying for? Fund alternative curriculum interventions that also use validated tools. Incentivize new voices and approaches. I think the comment about how do we kind of look at gender and what's in these programs is really important. Do these really speak to all the people that are being asked to pay for them? Is it actually gender responsive? Is it culturally appropriate? All those things, how do we get to quality and not just kind of focus on the cost, but also get to enable more providers that have more quality options for people? And that'll be kind of a public facing brief, but the idea is to kind of just, kind of raise this up a little bit, that the business model of the domestic violence policy has implications for probation as well as for providers to actually provide and meet all the expectations people have. The other one that actually is available, and I'll put this in the chat, was we kind of looked at like how do we kind of better integrate behavioral health into domestic violence kind of sphere. And partly because I think the issues that a lot of these people face are complex, substance use being one of them. We didn't really find a lot of incidents of serious mental illness per se, but a lot of the things that people actually have a prevalence of are things like borderline personality disorders, other kind of ways that they're kind of not really able to kind of live or understand the implications of their actions. Some of those are traditional behavioral health interventions, but really we're trying to look to better understand how do you balance the risk to reoffense with the human service needs. And we also know that substance use, these all interfere with people's ability to actually complete a batterer's intervention program. Even if they are, put in this program, if they have concurrent mental health or substance use issues, how can they be in this program effectively if they're really not able to, again, fully be there because of other mental health needs? Offenders often return to their victim, I would say, with mild to moderate mental health needs and really kind of unchanged, because the domestic violence interventions really don't address those specifically. They're really about thinking and thought processes and domestic violence overall, but maybe not really going to address these mild and moderate mental health needs if they're out there. And also things I said before, really that maybe people don't always meet the medical necessity for some of the substance use interventions or mental health needs, but how do we kind of make sure this can be blended together, or at least better integrated? When we actually would talk to a couple of counties who tried to actually work with behavioral health in a more integrated way, I think it was really challenging because people kind of immediately jumped to the batterer's intervention program that they offer to victims, but didn't really think that how do they actually look at the offenders themselves and the trauma that they've had? Because some of the studies that I've reviewed, 35% of domestic violence perpetrators had a history, a pretty high level of ACEs, or being domestic violence victims themselves. So it's a certain cycle to domestic violence that we all kind of see play out. But because the offenders are the ones who are being treated, they're not always treated for the underlying trauma that they have. And because it's what they've done is so egregious sometimes, we don't kind of see that as a trauma in and of itself. But how do we better integrate that and kind of see it together? And this kind of gets to kind of how we kind of looked at this was we actually created like a matrix, and I'll kind of explain this, but people's DV risk versus their general risk to reoffend. And so what we kind of find is that people's needs are very different when you actually kind of go about it and kind of look at what this matrix looks like. And so when we kind of did like the risk needs responsivity version of this, 47% are low risk to reoffend and low risk for DV. Doesn't mean they don't have needs, but they're the ones you might put into a low dosage DV program, but then also maybe have some kind of other kind of human service need attached to it. And then, as I said, as you kind of move up the rail, people that are high DV risk, again, a lower number overall, but again, those are the folks you want to intervene with more stringently, and also make sure your intervention dosage is higher. But the idea is to kind of overlay that with the actual needs they have. And this is a repeat of the chart I showed before, but of those people that are low risk for DV and low risk for domestic violence, 50% had a criminogenic need around substance use. Education and employment was fairly high. So as you can kind of see, the other four aren't as prevalent, but the big four, are still there as well. If you looked at high risk, obviously you'd have a bigger number of more people that needed had criminal history issues, pro-criminal attitudes, just because that's the way these tools work. But this is kind of the low risk version. The high risk version kind of shows a lot more of these needs concurrently as well. Last slide, and then I'll do the chat of the ones in the chat. I know we got a couple in there. And so we also know that it takes motivation and risk factors for domestic violence, or they're complex. And how do we kind of look at general risk and DV risk together? But also these reduction goals may not look the way we want them to do in the time we have with them during the program. Again, usually BAPs aren't really set up to meet multiple needs and require multiple referrals, but also their funding streams aren't there to really support the clinical expertise probably to meet some of these more complex needs. So I'm going to stop there and kind of go with questions and kind of open it up. So I'm going to start going through the chat ones. Danielle, if you can, or actually maybe I can open it up for questions, and then maybe I can kind of go through these as I'm kind of thinking.
Yeah, happy to. And I know there was a couple of comments and questions in the chat, some of which I think may have been answered amongst some of the participants today, but if you want to take a look through there, and I'll just also encourage participants to raise your hand if you have a question as well. Feel free to use the chat.
Let's see, so I'm going to hit a couple of these, and if people want to come off mute, just raise their hand and we'll kind of cycle back.
Yeah.
So yeah, I have heard of a few that actually their reporting center is doing the BIP, not only do the BIP, but actually how they fund it. But it's not that common yet. To me, that's actually kind of a natural choice because you have a location, you actually have a way to actually have that be maybe part of the contract with the provider if you want to have them do the BIP. But that actually is one way that actually, I think Yolo County, if I'm remembering their example, actually is funding their day reporting center provider to actually provide the service for free there if they meet certain criteria. So that's one county that is doing that. I can get a little more information on how they did that or kind of their funding side, but the idea is that it's really at the BFP is offered free at the day reporting center. And oh, Calaveras, they are, Kern County and Solano. Because the benefit is it's a single place. You kind of control the environment, you control the technology, you can control a lot of things about it. And I think that also is, one of the benefits of having that be a day reporting center. And then usually the challenge only is really going to be with the hybrid model, make sure people can get there in person versus kind of some other things.
And there's a question from Teresa in there as well on assessments.
I think in their case management practices they are, but I think in terms of our kind of assessment matrix, we're just using the ODARA at this, or that's kind of what was chosen universally. So all 6 counties use the ODARA. I believe 1 or 2 also have other lethality assessments on top of that, but I'm not sure that's being used kind of for this part of it though. Or they get that information. I'm not sure it's part of their decision-making framework though.
Just looking through if there's any other questions, comments, please feel free to put those in the chat. All right.
And I think, and one of the things kind of ahead for us, just, kind of round this out, is we're also, I think as we kind of think about this, like what are some of the tools and the kind of lessons learned, not just from a provider point of view, but from how you go from assessment to supervision to actually referrals, and what does that look like, and how to kind of boost up some of the better practices we've seen, as well as just some of the decision-making tools that are out there. The other, we actually have we're also developing kind of an inventory of kind of different certification processes, because with each county doing its own certification approach, again, you have a lot of different ways to do that. How can we kind of learn from how those work and how to kind of look at those a little more creatively, and also develop kind of, again, I guess something of a library. And I think the idea is maybe share it with CPOC as a way, just a resource for DD officers to have more of a library of things to choose from as they develop their local programs.
All right. Any other questions, comments? Want to make sure we capture those and reflect those in the discussion. All right. Was there anything else, Kevin? Just wanted to make sure that we were.
Well, I think probably the 2 things. So, I'll package up the PowerPoint from today, and I'll also have basically a last page. We'll have a bunch of links, some of our legislative reports that we're writing, as well as the dashboard that actually has basically more information to kind of see demographics of different counties, the behavioral health kind of write up and kind of brief, as well as kind of basically kind of, I think at least our hope is, some materials for you all to kind of look at and hopefully share. The road ahead for us, I guess we're hoping that the pilot actually gets extended indefinitely. That would be great, because I think we have a really great cohort of counties that are using lots of different curriculum, trying lots of things, asking lots of questions. We're hoping to find ways to kind of boost that up to state level actors to make sure they can kind of see that, things are changing in counties, and there's a lot of moving parts all the time, but we're learning a lot from the pilots. And then how do we get to efficacy? Did it work? What does work mean? And how do we kind of make sure we can communicate that effectively? But also, again, the nuance of both behavior change of the person who's committed the act, but also making sure victims and survivors see changes as well. And some of that might end up being working a little upstream more, and actually kind of looking more at the pretrial process, not just kind of the programming outputs of it.
Great, thank you. And I know there was some question just about, obviously there's a lot of discussions happening in this space and kind of pending things in this space. So more to come. I think this is really obviously important work, and the timing to look at this and bringing the evidence-based approaches to these programs is really key. So appreciate Kevin all of the work you're doing, and I know very helpful for you to share all of the information you did today. So just before we conclude, just one kind of final check, if there's any other final questions, comments. Give it just a minute here.
Also, if any of the pilot county, I know that I see a couple of people on and off here. Any of the pilot counties want to kind of speak up. I give everybody kind of a free pass from either just kind of lurk as kind of hanging out. But if anyone has anything to kind of talk about or anything to clarify what I said or say it better, please do, or it's okay not to.
All right, well, I think we've captured and questions in the chat, and I see some kind of comments and discussion, which is happening, which is great. So with that, Kevin, anything else as we wrap up?
I don't think so. Just thank you to the pilot counties for being just awesome partners and, you know, kind of letting us into their backyards, I guess. It's been just a great partnership and really been just great to learn along with people that are, you know, trying to make these changes. So I hope other counties, yeah, got some good new information, and also any materials we can also provide. We're happy to develop those.
Kevin, can you put the PowerPoint in the chat? It's being requested. I don't know if that's the best way to do it, or if maybe we can send it out. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll PDF it and send it to the team, and then you all can distribute it. And I'll have a couple of the report links as well, and go from there. But yeah, everything in here I've discussed, as well as the links, will go in there.
Well, appreciate it again, Kevin. Thank you so much. Really important topic and work. So I want to thank everybody for attending today, and we'll get those materials out to you here soon. Hope everybody has a great afternoon. Thank you.
Bye.